Hello there. Hope you're all doing really well out there with this fantastic world we call coaching and people development. Wanted to jump in before this episode starts to let you know about an event coming up in a few short weeks' time, 14th of April. I've teamed up with the fantastic sports staff at Stuart's Melville College in Edinburgh to bring you Talent Equation Live 2, Talent Equation Live 2 The Revenge. And I'm really excited to be joined by two of the most fantastic people that I've met in my time working within the sports development and coaching industry. I'm going to be joined by Dr. Ed Corlin from Cork Institute of Technology. One of the most engaging, insightful, and fascinating speakers that you'll be able to come and learn with, who is just so intriguing with his thoughts and ideas around skill acquisition and athletic development and how we can help young people learn. So he'll be there, and also one of my good friends and mentors, Jamie Edwards from Train Brain, who will be sharing with you his life experiences of working with elite athletes, young people across a range of different contexts and disciplines, particularly with the focus around helping them develop the tools, as he would refer to them as, the tools to be able to navigate their way through a life of sport, particularly with a focus on how we can help them becoming independent and powerful learners. And so the three of us combined will be able to do some speaking, also work in some smaller groups, doing some Q&A, as well as doing some practical activities that will really get people going away with some real life practical things that they can bring straight into their coaching and hopefully help them work in a more effective way with the young people they're engaged with. So I really hope you can join us. It's going to be a great day of learning. Tickets are selling really quickly, so I'd recommend getting on board as quickly as possible. There's going to be a link in the show notes, and also there's an events page on my website if you want to be able to access that and come and join us on the day. Look forward to seeing you if you come. If not, obviously enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
So Marianne, I'm indebted to you for actually starting the ball rolling with this, because you proposed it as an idea, and I went, as I usually do, oh yeah, that's a really great idea, and then you only went away and organised it all, and now it's happening, which is great, because had it been left to me, it probably wouldn't have happened. So I'm very pleased that it has.
I am. I'm just so pleased that everybody went, yeah, that sounds brilliant, because I'm kind of so used to thinking, oh, I'm sure this would be really good. And from a completely selfish perspective, it's just amazing to be able to, there's so much stuff like this that I think is relevant for so many of us and so many other people.
Yeah.
And having just a slightly different community of practice that's I think it's a really exciting thing to do. So I was being completely selfish in that. And then I thought, actually, I think that might be quite interesting for the people to listen to as well, because it's a little bit different from what's out there, isn't it? Just one person discussing their thoughts, but to have a conversation of a few different people.
Yeah. Well, it's very much so just so you know, Ben, it's very much this is a bit of an experiment, so bear with us a little bit. But it's very much like a digital open house. So you may find that people sort of drop in and drop out because they either can't get here exactly for 7 or whatever it might be. Phil's searching for a decent internet connection, I can tell. So I'm glad he's here. So anyway, welcome to Ben. Great to have you here. Welcome to an experiment in learning, let's call it, and indebted to you for being prepared. I've also sort of billed it as a micro symposium. I'm not sure if that's too grandiose a title, but the idea really is, I suppose, for you to come on and kind of talk about a particular article that we've all been looking at and we've been reading and has shared amongst ourselves. And then the idea, I suppose, is for you to come and essentially walk us through it, and then that then stimulates a discussion which might involve some questions to you, might involve alternative avenues. And the idea, I suppose, is to try and marry the practice and the theory a little, because within the group we've got both theorists and practitioners, and some people who are both theorist and practitioner. In fact, I think everybody's theorist and practitioner. I'm pretty much solely practitioner. I'd like to think of myself as a theorist, but I really can't claim to that. Whereas other people in the group are actually doing proper research, so they can claim to that. Anyway, so I guess a bit over to you, really. And if you wouldn't mind kind of like walking us through the paper and sort of giving us it doesn't even have to be a whistle-stop tour. Take as long or as short as you like, and then we'll open the conversation from there, if that's all right.
I think we could start off with how we come about to write the paper and start the programme of work, if that's okay.
Yeah, and also, actually, I've been a bit remiss. Probably best introducing yourself to the world as well. Right. So let's start with that.
Not my strong point, but here we go. So I'm Ben Strafford, and I'm a PhD researcher at Sheffield Hallam University, and I sit within the Sport and Physical Activity Research Centre. And I'm supervised by Professor Keith Davis, Dr. Joseph Stone, and Dr. Jamie North down at St Mary's. You might have met them 3 at conferences along the way. And my real interest is skill transfer and talent development. So my PhD is focused on ideas what are built off this manuscript. I'm examining parkour as a donor sport for athlete development, which we'll get onto. So that's just the general gist and my brief overview. And now I'll get on to talking about the paper, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah.
So the real roots of this paper are quite a few years old now. We started talking about it back in 2016 over coffee. And one of the authors on the paper, Paul Ben Strafford, I first met him when he's a parkour athlete, when he came to Sheffield to do a visiting researcher internship within the research centre Keith sits in. And I used to watch him and his mates train on the steps and rails around heart of the campus, which is basically Keith's office. You think you've been there a few times, Marianne, and Stuart certainly has.
Yeah.
And I used to watch him do parkour, and Powell's grounded in the same theoretical campus as me in terms of like from ecological psychology. And we got talking to how the ideas can be applied to parkour, can be applied to sort of talent development and applying those ecological dynamics perspectives to it. And I just ran with that and wrote the paper around that as a central concept, but then integrating some of the new ideas from the athletic skills model to make it a little bit more up to date and practitioner based. And that's just the background and motivations for the work, really. So that's the motivations. Then we'll get on to the overview of the paper, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so I've got a copy of the paper up. Let me just rejig my memory. So the whole premise of the paper is that parkour style activities can be scaled down and integrated into team sport practice because they share similar characteristics with sub-phases of team sports. For instance, parkour's they develop cutting maneuvers using a tic-tac technique, which is a specific activity done in parkour when they traverse off of walls. And one example, that's the example we put in the paper, and we suggest that that is representative of the sidestep cutting maneuvers in rugby, for instance, to evade, to do the joint loading to evade the opponent, and that sort of stuff. But one key thing and key message that we're proposing here is that parkour as a donor sport centrally is diversification. So it's allowing a diversified movement experience in contrast to traditional coaching practice, which is very repetitive and drill-based. And how we propose that is through the donor sport concept from the athletic skills model. So the athletic skills model proposes that athletes have to transition through from diversified activities to more specialised activities as they develop. And the donor sport concept falls in the middle. So they can sample loads of different activities, but they can also sample donor sports that, although they aren't the focus sport, what they want to specialise in, it shares some of the common characteristics that are required to perform well. So there's been limited research done substantiating the donor sport concept, and that's what we're focused on. Outside our research group, there's one paper on futsal and how that can inform behaviours in football. So we've referenced that in the paper. And I suppose a big coming towards end of the ideas of the paper itself is the conclusion sections based a lot on practical application of the findings to coaching practice. And that's one thing we were really interested in, is how can we take this massive, broad depth of knowledge in terms of from a theoretical perspective and relay it to coaches and practitioners, because after all, the athletic skills model proposes the coach as the environmental designer. So that's the current opinion piece. And do you want me to talk about how we've built on from that?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. So we took those ideas, and I started my PhD 2 years ago, and we thought, how can we develop a program of research that advances theoretical understanding, but also is purposeful and relevant for applied practice? So my PhD is a mixed methods PhD, where I'm integrating loads of different components similar to Marianne's. So what I've been doing over the past year or so, and it's just got accepted last week in Qualitative Research Sport Exercise and Health, is I've been interviewing parkour athletes on the sort of skills that they perceive to be developed through parkour, and also from that, how they will then recommend designing parkour practice to facilitate the development of those skills. And what we're going to do with that experiential knowledge, that really rich understanding of the activities and the practice landscapes in parkour, is we're going to use it to develop, we have used it to develop testing protocols for field research. But at the same time, we're recruiting for a study now where we're going to interview experienced talent development coaches. If any of the listeners would like to be interviewed for that, you've got to have around 10 years experience in talent development. And we want to sample that experience knowledge on the ideas, what the parkour coaches and athletes have said to us. So we get a more holistic understanding of, hey, this is our parkour, the skills that could be developed through parkour. This is what this experiential group, knowledge from this group have said. What do you think of this understanding? Do you agree? Do you disagree? What do you agree with? How do you think these ideas could be implemented into your practice? So we're wedding both camps, really. Experienced parkour coaches and experienced talent development coaches. And we want to take both of these groups' opinions and gel them together so we can create intervention programs to target the development of the skills that they identify. So they identify the parkour athletes physical skills, strength, endurance, agility, balance, perceptual skills, coordination, timing with movement, spatial differentiation, psychological skills, self-efficacy, cognitive appraisal, and social skills such as network and initiative. So once we've got that, and we're also running our series of field-based research with a local parkour park, where we're looking at some of the physical characteristics of parkour athletes completing a run compared to team sport and control, so we can draw them comparisons, and that should be with you, well, in the summertime, I would hope so, but we know what the review process is quite long. But one thing I've got to add while we're on this forum is the parkour community are absolutely great. Like, they're so welcoming, and they want to really advance practice as much as possible and get parkour science out there. They're really, really keen. They're the most welcoming and best group of people I've worked so far with in terms of running applied research projects. They're really, really good. And that goes for athletes from all over the globe. We're in contact with people in UK, Netherlands, America. They've all shared the same drivers of us, of, you know, enhancing understanding of parkour, but also of talent development. Like a few of them said to me, you know, my key priority is to develop, when people come to me to train parkour, I want to get faster, stronger, fitter, but I also want to feel more confident within myself, develop a network with my peers, all that sort of stuff. It's amazing. I not coming from a parkour background, I were really happy to see that. So good. But I've not done parkour myself. I did try it a few times, but it's not for me. I'm not very good at it. Some videos in me somewhere from my pilot testing. Maybe if you ask Joe Stone nicely, they'll show him you.
That should be like that should be like bonus content, really.
Yeah. What do these YouTube channels do now? If you join the Patreon, you get
the bonus content, like the blooper reel.
Yeah, I've got a little bit on that I think might be worth sharing. I wanted to talk to a couple of people, including actually there's a guy within British Canoeing who does talent, who's a talent transfer coach. So we can talk maybe a little bit about that later, but he'd certainly be keen. But it's paddle sports. But when I said to people, "Oh, well, this is a paper about parkour as a donor sport," they went, "I know it's dangerous, but that's a bit, you know, it's not that bad, is it?" And I'm like, no, it's donor to other sports.
Oh, really?
But 3 people said the same thing. They're like, "That's a bit harsh."
Parkour as a donor sport. Well,
I think they just had like a James Bond idea in their head. You know? Like, no, it's donor to other sports. Sport.
Right. So if I could just kick off, because I've got some, I definitely got some things to I guess, some thoughts. So the first thing that sort of jumped out to me was you mentioned earlier on. So if I understand correctly, the approach you're now taking to do the research is to, am I right in thinking that you're going to triangulate the, I guess, the testimony of parkour athlete, parkour coach, and wider talent development coach? Is that correct, or is it just parkour coach and talent coach?
So the way the PhD's got different phases. Well, obviously different studies for mine. Yeah. So my first paper or study, for instance, was the opinion paper to set the theoretical ideas in frame. And then I've interviewed the parkour athletes and coaches to get their experiential knowledge on skills developed through parkour and learning design. But then we found there were a gap in the research, or our program research we're setting out. It's okay to have this experiential knowledge, but if you don't sample some of the experiential knowledge from the target group that you're wanting to approach to run these interventions with these learning environments that have been designed from the experiential knowledge of parkour coaches, there's no understanding of what that group think of the ideas. And so in a sense, some sort of triangulation, but we keep it very pragmatic, so it's fluid. There's no real set structure.
I see. because it struck me that one of the features of parkour is it's one of those sports that's very athlete led, in the sense that, athlete and peer, almost like peer to peer development through, kind of challenging themselves to do something different or new, and getting feedback from peers, or working with somebody to try and work out a particular move or whatever it might be. Yeah. That seems to be a particular feature. And also, one of the things I do know about the sport, because it only relatively recently was recognised as a kind of sport in its own right, which is an entirely different story, and I'm pretty sure you know some of that. Is one of the things about it is that its sort of coaching world is very informal, in the sense that they don't have a formal coaching structure as such, and in many ways probably shouldn't have. I would argue, but I just wondered how you're going to go about, I guess, the identification of and whether you're going to use a mixture of athlete coach, athlete coaching, and then maybe somebody in a more formal coaching role who might be staffing like you get these, like you say, I think in the paper you make reference to the fact that parkour centres are now popping up all over the place where you can do it in relative safety. So I wonder if that's one of the avenues you might take.
Yeah, so we've got good connections with a local parkour gym in Rotherham. Great bunch of people really interested in the developing parkour research, and their environment actually matches some of the recommendations from our second paper, which we've talked quite briefly on, about the one where we sampled parkour athletes' perceptions of skills developed through parkour and learning design, in the fact that the landscape is modular, so you can change the objects around relatively easily for certain difficulty levels and age ranges, which they do a lot for like kids' parties or for certain competitions, because they're one of the only gyms in the UK that runs a parkour competition twice a year, which people come from all over the world to take part in, and their environment is known for being pretty innovative. But in the paper we mention how, if a coach and athlete can't if a coach can't get their athletes or doesn't have the money to take their athletes to a parkour environment, they can use certain gym equipment to scale those activities down into bite-sized chunks, so to speak, what they can integrate into the normal practice routine.
So take a standard, almost like school gymnasium, using the equipments there, and essentially create kind of parkour style. Yeah. I do on a very different scale. I do something similar with my kids in our local playground. Yeah. We actually do what I call Ninja Warrior. And yeah. I time them while they, I create a course for them, and then they work their way through, and they have to go through various things and do in a certain time. And of course, you have to make the time work for the different age ranges and all that sort of stuff. And you have to create an appropriate amount of time where, an 8-year-old's time versus a 12-year-old's time works. And I always get that wrong, and then I get in trouble. So I'm well versed in the adaptability of environments for a kind of parkour style experience.
One thing that really interests us in my supervisory team, and we want to look at as an intervention in a team sport setting, is the extreme tag game. I don't know if you've seen it on YouTube. Yeah. Using that as an intervention, because if you think about it, what you're adding there is an opponent element, so you're having to negotiate the environment, but then the opponent's body movements and behaviours as well, which is more representative of the team sport activity.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, so it's a nice segue actually, because and I imagine, Marianne, you've got something on this. So actually, maybe I'll shut up and let you come in, and then we can riff off that.
Well, I think about the opponents.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I was interesting, because when I first looked at this quite a long time ago, and I read the title, and the first thing I thought was, I can really see how parkour is brilliant for sports where there isn't an opponent. So I was thinking, yeah, great for skating, great for climbing, great for mountain biking, like that really fits. And then I was thinking team sports, and then I always try and think about what I think is going to be the paper before I read it. It's kind of what I would imagine being in there. Yeah. And but yeah, that bit really interested me, and as I read through, I could really understand this. Certainly the sort of being able to move skillfully and land which is kind of where I was thinking. But I was thinking, I bet that the boys across the pond, Tyler and that lot, they kind of use a little bit of this, don't they? And then they are the opponent, or they put another opponent in there so that they create those two elements. Yeah. So that was kind of what I was thinking with that. When they said, oh, I really love to be here, I thought, yeah, it's really similar to the stuff that they're basically trying to design.
Yeah, they do the extreme tag games.
Just not so much the extreme tag, but what they do is they set up sort of activities. It's American footballers, isn't it, that they work with mostly? But then they'll sort of be an opponent, or they'll move, and they'll have someone else in there to add that element in of having someone else in the environment that they're interacting with.
Have to get some collaborations going.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, the guys over in the States, so like you've got Tyler Yearby and Sean Mishka, who are both working with NFL players, and they've got a community they've created called Emergence, and in fact, at the moment they've got a whole load of stuff on social media celebrating the work of Gibson, and so it's worth tracking. But that's, I guess, if they were here, that would be one of the questions I think they posed, which is the idea of they're always, I guess, trying to stay as they're trying to maintain fidelity with the like you say, representativeness of the experience, and nearly always, wherever possible, and I'm certain they will do elements of what you might call at least semi-isolated type activity. But in the main, the vast majority of the work they do, and these are elite NFL athletes, has an opponent or some opponent element within it in order to maintain that representativeness. Yeah. So I was wondering how this plays against that. Just before you answer, Ben, just welcoming Jimmy Vaughan to the thing. James, good to see you. Can you hear us? I know you're muted at the moment. Here you go.
Oh, I can. It's it's nice to be here. I've got my video off as well at the moment because I'm eating my dinner, so I've muted.
Well, that's fine, not a problem. You sort of caught us halfway through, but you've probably just caught us at the right time, because we're just in the process of actually just starting to just pose some questions to Ben, and then we're just going to then just see where the discussion takes us in truly talent equation emergent style. So I hope you can just bear with us. Anyway, just coming back to the representative question then, Ben, because I'm interested in that about the athletic skills model in itself, because there's elements of the athletic skills model that sort of, and I've asked you one question, I'm going to ask you another one, so I'm conscious of that. But the athletic skills model to me feels a little bit linear. It feels a little bit like, you do this and then you build on this with this and then you build on this with this. And I feel, I don't know, I have a sense of disquiet about it, but I know it's something that I've seen presented at a number of different forums, including ESAN and a variety of others. And it feels like that research community feels as if the athletic skills model does have, I don't know, some theoretical validity, but I have a few questions. So I suppose I was just going to leave you with those two ideas, and then we could just explore.
Yeah. I can see where you're coming from with the rigidity. But the way I refute that is, if you look at the figure, what the authors have made, where if you see the transition from one side diversification, one side specialization activities, and the overlap between different concepts, so basic movement skills, advanced movement skills, multi-sports, donor sports, not necessarily in that order, but they're the components. Yeah. And one thing me and Keith were chatting about, and we explain it, it's like a DJ's dial. You can click on it and you can move it up and down as much as you want. Mm-hmm. It's not fixed in a certain place. As the coach, you're in charge of how much you move it up to this end for specialization and how much you move it down to this end for diversification. You're the designer of that environment. So as a coach, you're in control of what your athletes do, really.
I think I get that idea, and for anybody who is listening to this and hasn't yet seen the paper, obviously there's a link to the paper, and you will understand the diagram because it's actually front and center in the paper, and so you'll see that in the show notes. And when I post this on the blog, I'll also take that image and I'll put it onto the blog post as well, so people will have an immediate reference point.
That diagram, just so we don't have any confusion, that diagram we're talking about is the one from the Athletic Skills Model book.
Ah, I get it. Okay,
yeah,
okay.
That's probably why it didn't make sense to you there.
No, but I've seen it, and I know which one you mean, and I understand the reference point, and I understand the idea. In fact, the idea of almost like a DJ mixing desk is one I reference a lot when I'm talking about representative learning design, because it feels like you're doing that live in the moment when you're right there. Yeah. I guess the bit for me though, it feels a little bit though. So I suppose one of the things in the and by all means other people can jump in and help me out here, right, because I'm obviously thinking aloud, but the bit for me here that I'm sort of struggling with a little bit is one of the things that, say for example, James will do in AIK and his counterparts, Mark and Dennis and a few others. And one of the things that they're actually live experimenting with, and Mark, and I know you know about Mark's research. Yeah. One of the things they're doing is creating that representative experience, albeit within a specific sports context, and maintaining the informational variables in the environment continuously in order for the movements to emerge as a response to the other environmental stimulus. And you're obviously dialing up and dialing down how many of those variables are in place. And I suppose experimenting almost and exploring how movements emerge as a response to those environments without removing too many of those informational variables. The theory being that by removing those informational variables, you will essentially lose the understanding between the athlete of why a movement needs to happen, because it's obviously a stimulus response type of thing. It's not, but you know what I mean. My worry is slightly here is we're almost saying, right, you need these fundamental building blocks. And I'm worried slightly about transferability. I mean, if Andrew Wilson was on the call, he talks a lot about transferability. So I would be slightly worried, or I'd be interested to hear what he would say about that, because my concern might be is that you're essentially, by the way, let's differentiate between the chase games, right, which do have that response, and the development of movement as a movement idea in response to somebody else's movement. I'm all for that, and I really get that. But my worry would be is that if you do parkour in its kind of traditional sense, where it's essentially you and an environment, and it's about how you move through an environment, but the objects in the environment are relatively stable, albeit, it's dynamic. But you haven't got anything that says to you, oh, you must move here now because otherwise this might happen because you've got somebody else. So that response element is the bit that I'm slightly concerned about. Let me bring in James, because I know he's just put his dinner down to jump in here, just to expand on that, and then we can just see where we go from there.
Yeah, I'd like to, when he's finished with the
go on then. Yeah,
I'm going to get real geeky and reference page 3 in the paper, but I noted this morning reading through it, and I think it just it might relate to your point, Stu, and it was around the foot placement and the discussion around that in parkour. And I think I've only got a note here, but my question around that is that it talks about foot placement and being able to then help with landing on a ledge or judging that kind of leap. And then as the foot placement gets progressively more advanced, and it leads to the leap and the kind of ledge that you could get to being progressively more difficult, which I understand. But it also kind of references the same thing with like the flight of a ball. And I suppose piggybacking on Stu's point, I just wonder how representative it is to talk about a static ledge that we're jumping to versus the flight of a ball and then moving to intercept the flight of that ball. So it's not so much a question really as just something I want to throw out there to give a bit of context to what you were saying, Stu, I think.
No, that's good. That's fine. I mean, I'm more than happy to do that. Joe, I don't know. Yeah. Before Marianne, do you want to come in first, and then we'll allow Ben to just try and...
it's interesting. I mean, this is one of the things that's fascinating about this, is I know that we're all going to see and think different things about what we read. And when I started reading this, the first thing that I thought about was obviously people I've worked with who've done stuff in talent transfer, but also that my son, he didn't do parkour, but he did a lot of skating. So I'd be like on everyone's rail, grinding down anything that was stable for more than a couple of minutes got skated on. And he did a lot of bouldering, and both of those are very similar activities. And it's just that incredibly self-motivated exploration of movement within a particular environment. But then when he started whitewater paddling, one of the things he said to me was that, which is completely different, you've got totally different perceptual information. And he said, I'm really happy about being upside down or this shape or landing stuff. So he was taking those movement skills, he was looking at environment and going, I can make that gap. I can get under there. So he was able to in some way recognize his ability in terms, if you think about maybe speed of movement and recognizing that he can transfer that to a different space, but he can still move that fast. He can transfer being upside down to a different environment and still be okay upside down.
But would he be transferring to an environment that wasn't dynamic, like a team game?
No, the water's moving a little bit, but it's not a team game. So yeah, this was why when I read the title, I'm like, I can really see how this works in the sports I'm familiar with, but I'm fascinated about how it would work into a team game. So the actual perceptual information didn't have to be the same, but that recognition of space, time, shape, what he could do off something was able to transfer. And he always said, I think that I'm really good at this because of the stuff that I've done in those other sports.
Intuitively, I can see that, right? My intuition is telling me I feel like we're right here. But my understanding, albeit limited, of the theory is also making me ask some questions. Yeah. So I suppose, back to you, Ben, you've heard a little bit of what we're thinking.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with most of the points that are being raised. But if you're thinking, I know when you talk about some of the movements or the exercises in parkour or the environment are quite static. I think at young ages, you're trying to develop the building blocks, aren't you? You're trying to develop the physical, perceptual skills required for them to develop as an athlete. And one thing about parkour is, as an environment, it allows for repetition without repetition. It allows for self-guided discovery of movement intrinsic to the athlete and their capabilities. And that doesn't matter if the objects in that environment are static. They're still being allowed to explore that in a variety of different ways. It's not like, to develop strength in football, I'm going to do a ladder drill with a ball, when that don't represent that. You're not going to develop the physical skill that way, are you? You're just going to develop ability to step between a ladder and kick a ball. But just going on to what James said about the lack of an opponent and that sort of criticism. We noticed that criticism, and we are trying to address it in our research that's coming up. That's one gap that we do need to substantiate further. Just letting you know that criticism is welcome, and it's something Mark's mentioned to me before as well. I know you're from the same place. So. I
was fairly certain he wouldn't have been shy in sharing you that opinion.
I like it. Mark and Rick Shuttleworth are great at getting your feedback. Definitely, yeah, good guys. If you're right, you're right, and if you're wrong, they tell you about it. It's what good friends do, isn't it? I suppose
that's true. Yeah.
I mean, just to jump in, I think I probably should note that I'm a big fan of the paper and a big supporter of working in this way. Definitely. So I've kind of jumped in halfway through my dinner and then come in with like a flying kick there. So.
I tried to find where it weren't paper because I couldn't find it, but I found it. One sentence. But an important sentence.
I think the thing for me is, so I guess the one thing I like is the idea that for me it's about, interestingly, I've had a debate recently with a number of colleagues, influential policymakers who are talking about physical literacy. And talking about physical literacy from the perspective of young people's experiences of sport and physical activity, based on a proposal, I suppose, that the development of movement competence leads to lifelong physical activity. And I'm not 100% sure, unless anyone can correct me, that the evidence backs that up. I think there is correlational evidence that suggests that people who are who participate in lifelong physical activity tend to have a association with movement competence as a reason for enjoyment. But the Active Lives Children's Survey, I think it's the 4th or 5th data point, came out recently from Sports England, and it basically talks about children's attitudes to physical activity, and the primary driver of engagement in physical activity is enjoyment by far, and competence is reported by children as being a relatively minor reason for participating, or for at least why they derive enjoyment. Why they participate. Their attitude, competence is not that as important. And the assumption is that actually, if you can become more competent, you will enjoy it more. And I don't know. I don't know if I agree, right? And I don't think the research backs that up. I think the research shows a correlation between competence and enjoyment, but it's mostly from people who are already active. I don't think inactive people necessarily need to be competent in order to enjoy. They can derive enjoyment from being relatively incompetent in the right setting, social dynamics, etc., etc. Anyway, it's a long-winded way of me getting around to this idea of one of the things I like about the idea that's presented here is that we may be able to marry the idea of movement competence and enjoyment by creating a playful experience that's exploratory, that also then develops movement competence. Now, whether or not that then transfers to team sports is a slightly different question. But the idea that's being proposed here, that an activity like parkour, and really important point here for me, is one of the things that differentiates parkour from many other activities is the playful, exploratory, discovering what you can do as an individual based on your perceptual understanding of an environment and physical capabilities. That's something that's kind of unique to parkour and those kinds of self-directed sports, before Marianne jumps in and goes, what about climbing, and what about bouldering, and what about the adventure sports? Because I'm not saying they don't either. But as far as kind of an accessible urban type activity that young people could engage in, are really attracted to that as an idea.
Yep.
And so I suppose there's a part of me that sort of, without wanting to do, but is that something that might come out from what you're doing here? Because I think that would be a really important contribution to the literature, certainly selfishly from my perspective, trying to tackle rising levels of inactivity amongst young people.
It could be we're taking a pragmatic approach to this sort of work, so whatever emerges, we can investigate.
Because I almost feel like the team sport bit, I understand why it's attractive, but there's a little part of me that almost feels like that maybe that's something we could get to in the end, but initially maybe it'd be really interesting to explore its role as not a donor to team sports, but a donor to lifelong physical activity outcomes. Maybe, I don't know.
That's another potential area, but we're focused on looking at the applications to team sports. But
okay,
it's a good idea, and we're happy to collaborate with you if you want to run a project on that in future.
Well, the Sheffield Hallam Research Institute is well known to Sport England,
Yeah.
and so we do quite a lot of work with you guys, particularly on the evaluation side.
Yeah.
And I did actually involve Keith in the past in an evaluation piece of work that I did. It wasn't really up his street, but something like that is something that it might be very interesting to look at. But but it's probably an offshoot of what you're doing, isn't it?
Yep, but it marries in well with some of the ideas, so I'd be happy to be involved in that if you shoot us an email. Who is the guy? Is it Dave Ember, the Sport England guy?
There's a number of different people it could be,
yeah.
But I'll chat to you offline and we can work it out. Yeah.
Can I jump in there a little bit?
Yeah.
So and I love that. That was kind of the next little bit of note that I had, that it's moving away from the idea that in this case, when I read this, I think it doesn't have to have the exact perceptual information, because actually what we're doing within Parkour is learning to explore, learning to experiment, learning to have that playful engagement with the environment, which is one of the key things that I see people take through from things like skating and bouldering and those other sports. And I guess the other thing that within this that I would like to see, and you talk about having this donor sport and going from a wider to a more narrow, but maybe it's just my age, but I'm also thinking this lifelong participation, something like parkour and these type of sports would hopefully support people going maybe into one sport and then maybe transferring through talent transfer or just through general activity to another sport,
yep.
to becoming active throughout their entire lives because they've learnt ways of engaging and learning, and again, certainly my son, but the people I work with, my dad is classic of this, and he just goes, I kind of know I can learn anything. I know that if I want to take up a different sport, I have the skill set to engage playfully in that sport. And I think that's what you were trying to get at, wasn't it, Stu? That you.
Yeah, it's two things. It's kind of learning about learning.
Learning to learn, yeah. Learn about learning.
And the love of it, and the love of exploration and learning and discovering new ways of doing things.
And it's totally self-determined.
Exactly, and then the second bit, and obviously guided from the perspective of safety, but also but very self-determined. And then the other aspect for me was not movement competence, but movement confidence.
Yeah.
And that idea that I can discover ways of solving a movement puzzle or a movement problem because I've learned the capabilities of doing so.
It's funny you should say that, because it's one of the findings that's coming out of this paper that just got accepted. A big thing in parkour is cognitive appraisal. So they see a challenge in the environment. Do they think they can make that jump? Do they think they can cross that obstacle? Yes, they can. They'll try it. They often linked it to heightened self-efficacy, leads to an ability to just let go physically and try new things in the environment. So it's interesting. That cognitive appraisal, appraising their ability relative to the task and the environment, is something that's really interesting. I think can be applied to a lot of different avenues. For instance, it could be applied to rehabilitation when someone's trying to recover movement competencies after injury. It could be applied to different sporting environments, so in different populations, so to speak, walking football, all that sort of research that's hot in the sports that are hot in the literature at the minute. So there's loads of different avenues to apply these ideas. It's just being disciplined and focusing on one area for a bit, substantiating that. Yeah. As you know, you got to funnel your focus for a year. So.
Interestingly, the guys I talk about in British Canoe, the talent transfer, one of the sort of donor sport they tend to end up using is martial arts.
Yeah.
And the feedback that I've got from them is they come with great movement skills, but they're so used to being told exactly what to do and being error corrected. They have a nightmare of actually getting them to engage in their environment more playfully and develop. So that's actually quite a challenge for these guys with those athletes coming through.
One of the, I think, might have seen
Why they're buying into this stuff.
I think you've all seen one of my presentations by now, but if not, I'll just spoil it. There's no spoiler alert if you haven't. But one of the examples I always give as a donor sport is Zlatko Ibrahimovic. He did taekwondo as a child, and I always bring some print screens of his kicks from some of his goals, or if sometimes I put a video, but we all know what it's like. Videos don't always like to work, but he does like an overhead spinning style kick to score a few of his goals, and I put that with a screen grab of a taekwondo kick, and the action very much mirrors one another when side by side. So I always use that because it's a topical example, really. Just bouncing off the martial arts conversation that we just had.
Yeah, but they struggle to get them to be creative. They kind of want to be told what to do and how to do it. And
it's same because it's points based. So in parkour at the moment, one of the big cultural discussions is a lot of the print media are linking it to gymnastics and saying that parkour is like gymnastics. Well, parkour is not gymnastics. That's not a hashtag I've made. It's a hashtag that we're going around on Twitter and in some of the newspapers. And the reason is gymnastics. You have to hit certain points, like you have to do a certain movement to score points in trampoline in the pike movement, for instance. But in parkour, there's no set score there to execute a perfect movement for a perfect coach to score. There is some events where they scored, but they're not scored on like they don't get points for certain movements they do. It's just a judge's perception of how they move. But then the most commonly used competition in parkour are speedruns, where the only score is time, how quick they complete the route in. And that's what we're interested in, looking at the speedruns in more depth as well, because that metric of success in terms of getting quicker race times can be taken anywhere, whereas you can't take a judge's score, an expert score, everywhere you go into every single environment. That's a bit of a tangent, but I thought I'd just get that in.
No, definitely relevant.
Ben, I wonder with that one now, are we at risk of kind of optimizing a movement? If we're timing it, I mean, the exploration, I imagine people might narrow in on a specific route or a specific way of kind of, I mean, for me, the idea of parkour and then the idea of kind of transferring martial arts movements into different sports is kind of that. We've explored a new way of moving in one setting and it becomes relevant in another setting.
That's right. The thing is, no one's telling the athletes in these speedrun parkour activities, you need to follow this set route to get the lowest time. There's a certain direction they have to take, but there's no specific movements that they have to execute. It's just get from this start point to this end point in the most efficient way possible around the course. But it just goes back to what I mentioned at the start. So, right, I take that point. You can't have an athlete train on the same environment for 6 months without it being variable, because it defeats the whole object of what we argue in the paper. And that's why it's important that the landscapes are modular, so you can change them around every so often to give those new challenges for the athletes to explore. And that'll make sense more once this paper becomes available online. But I can send you a preprint copy because it's been accepted now, and I'm happy to discuss that with everyone further offline or maybe at another time.
I think the thing the thing for me, even about that, is that I think the thing that James is alluding to is how easily competitive forms can almost pervert the true essence of the activity, because I think the same applies in the team sport context, where competitive experiences lead to performers and or coaches looking for what they might say in inverted commas is the most efficient means by which for them to become successful. And by doing that, they essentially massively narrow down the performance landscape. And as a result of that, they also narrow down opportunities for exploration, which is, I guess, one of the things that the ecological community is railing against. We're saying we want to try and keep the performance landscape and the learning landscape as open and as exploratory as it can be, particularly in the learning space. And then we're going to try and resist the temptation to reduce down to efficient movement patterns that are deemed to be suitable for or more suitable for competitive outcome. And so I suppose we're trying to find the balance point between that.
Because I took an active choice to really engage and get to know, rather than just be, you can run some projects where you'll send a population group an email and be, I'm doing this project, can I use you as an example? Well, I wanted to really get to know the parkour community, both around where I'm from, but also from different countries. And the central tenet overall is they reject the traditional coaching methodologies of optimal movement patterns. They like their athletes to explore the environment in the way they see fit. They're very, very contemporary in their approach. The skills, the speed are just used for fun, really. The thing is, there's very rarely competitions that have prize money. They just do it to get together with the communities. And it's the community vibe that drives that exploration of the environment. They often take part in these activities, the parkour athletes, in jams where they go and they challenge each other to do certain jumps, and it's used a lot for building confidence in movement, but also receiving feedback, which again is completely different to a traditional approach as you'd expect, where it's only the coach that gives feedback, not the peers.
But that would be more interesting for me than research with races. What would be really interesting would be the conditions that stimulate those jam sessions.
Yeah.
And from a very biased viewpoint, like if I'm taking a football team, let's say a group of young boys, to a parkour obstacle course, and I'm going, we're going to do some races. Well, they aren't going to explore it in the way that would be most beneficial for them. They will they'll bolt over the thing and get to the end as quick as they can, probably, knocking, dings in their heads and things like that, anything to get there first, which can obviously still have some benefit. But if they were introduced to this culture, this community, whereby they're exploring different ways of moving and perhaps working in groups to figure out what might be what's the best way that we can negotiate this obstacle and find a good thing to do here, and then let's your group challenge another group, or I feel infusing the community feeling and all that comes with the movement practice, that would be massive. That would be really important, I think. I wouldn't want us to make it too much of a competition too quickly and lose some of that good stuff.
Am I right in thinking, Ben, as well? Because I do know quite a bit about parkour. I've come to a good friend of mine is the chair of Parkour GB or Parkour UK, and because they've only become a codified sport relatively recently, last few years, 4 or 5 years. And going back to your point about one of the things I do know is going back to your point about parkour is not gymnastics. #parkour is not. I know there was a fairly public and fairly acrimonious dispute between parkour and gymnastics, because I think gymnastics wanted to essentially assimilate parkour, and so it was essentially a gymnastic activity, and parkour fought very hard not to be within that. And so they become their own sport. But I'm right in thinking, aren't I, that there's there's almost like a purist community that rejects the idea of competitive parkour and almost say, no, that's not what parkour is about. The true parkour is about movement within an urban or a rural, but mostly an urban environment, and exploring different ways of navigating, your own way and finding your own way through any kind of environment. They almost reject this idea of codification and formalizing of the parkour experience. Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah, as with any sport that has got a good origin story, there are loads of different generations of parkour athletes and people that do parkour, and their perceptions and beliefs do differ between that. But that's for another time, and we'll not get into that. But it's good to read about the history of parkour, and I definitely recommend reading around its origins. It's really interesting. But like I said, I don't like to get into the different approaches to it.
You don't want to dive into the socio-cultural layer then?
No.
See, that's James's wheelhouse right there.
Yeah.
There's water on the mill, that's all.
I think one thing for me would be nice to add, if that's okay, that I like the bit where they were talking about some of the psychological skills set within that, and again I remember the stuff within like street skating and things, which is not quite parkour, but sort of similar ideas, and the urban bike messing around, you think sort of Danny McCaskill's type stuff, is that dealing with pressure and risk, and that representative affective learning design thing that's going on there with them. I mean, I remember when my son was about 10 going, I'll build you a rail in the garden on the grass. And he's like, why would you do that? Like they wanted the landing. They wanted to learn to land a proper landing. That was important to him.
Yeah, the risk benefit analysis comes up a lot, especially when we're interviewing the parkour athletes.
And that ability to perform under pressure.
Yeah.
Learning to do it, and the risk benefit, and making good risk assessments, which touch wood, he's still very good at doing. It was that was the other bit that jumped out at me. That was really fascinating, and that like don't put a mat down. I can't remember where it is in the paper, but
somewhere
it's somewhere. And the idea of that sort of affective representativeness, and if you're going to be performing under pressure, it's quite a good way to learn to explore it and move, and learn to move with that pressure. Yeah.
So from that perspective, a learner in a parkour context is themselves, or the community is wanting to maintain fidelity. They don't want falseness.
Yeah.
Through safety measures, they're actually saying no, this needs to be as representative anyway, even if it's in a learning space.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the common misconception is that parkour is a high injury risk sport, and it's not. Actually, the amount of injuries in parkour what are documented are relatively low compared to other sports, and obviously the risk benefit analysis probably explains that. If they don't think they can do a jump, if they think it's unsafe, they just don't do it. And there's a lot of misconception that parkour athletes are these daredevils that jump over buildings and stuff. Some like to jump over buildings, but a lot of them understand their own what they can do, their own capabilities. And
so they're actually expert risk analyzers then? Yeah,
the risk benefit analysis skill. I don't know if we can call it a skill, but yeah, massively so. They understand the thing. What fascinates me is they are at one, or they understand their capabilities in terms of movement tenfold more so than any population group I've worked with. They know exactly what they can do with their body, and that's just through exploration and practice, or negotiating obstacles in different environments and trying things out and not being afraid to fail, and that they train how to fail out of movements, and that probably explains why they sometimes take those risks if they want to take them.
That to me sounds like the one of the biggest benefits there must be in terms of this awareness in their body, and the awareness in space there.
Yeah.
But one thing Ben, can you explain to me how cognitive appraisal, as you were describing before with the risk analysis, fits with perception of affordances?
Yep, 2 secs. Just, so in terms of, like, for instance, if you're looking at how large a gap there is within an environment, so that gap affords them to jump over it, for instance. So their cognitive appraisal is if they think they can jump over that object, and if they can appraise or guess the distance between it, they most likely will be able to produce that jump.
Okay. Correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding was that the direct perception is more of we've got a friend in the background now. My feeling was that with direct perception that kind of cognitive element is just less important, or potentially not such a guide.
Do you mean it's not such a guide, or they wouldn't be consciously thinking about it?
Yeah.
Because they'll still have an awareness of that affordance is linked to your ability, isn't it?
That example, what I told you then, was just one from a research paper that's already been published, Taylor and Witt, and they just asked them before they're saying, how high do you think this box is? Do you think you could jump it? Yes or no? And then they just made an attempt to jump the box, and they looked at differences between if they think they can jump it.
Okay, in my mind, it was a guy flying through the air and then coming to a ledge.
Yeah,
and then the split second decision making, or what I would call the perception of the affordance. Then, the affordance could be just to fall as well.
And land safely.
I mean, the thing is, if you turn to transfer, one thing parkour, it's still to be substantiated in the literature. We still need to do a lot more research on this. But the thing which it promotes is behavioural adaptability in many different settings. I don't know if you read our other paper, what we did with Ludovic Seifert and Ed Cockland, and there's loads of other authors, but we delve into them theoretical concepts around that in a bit more depth. So if you're wanting some more detail on that, probably best to go and read that.
That might be a future micro symposium paper for us to knock around.
Yeah, it's a really theory heavy paper, so probably block 6 or 7 hours out to talk about that shit.
But expand on behavioural adaptability for me, if you wouldn't mind.
So it's just being able to adapt to what their environment throws at them, to being able to adapt to challenges or changes in their environment. In essence, being able to adapt to achieve task goals. That's simplistic. So
coming back to the idea of a team sport, in the team sport context, so it develops the idea of behavioural adaptability by virtue of the fact that the performer is in charge of how they're going to move through space or move through an environment.
Yeah.
And I totally get that. I suppose the bit that the bit I have questions about is the element of behavioural adaptability that is created by the movement of another human in that space.
Yeah.
Whether that's a contradictory movement that is there designed to defy the movement you might want to make, or a complementary movement that assists you with whatever movement you want to make within the space.
That's another avenue to look at, and which we plan on doing, because you're not the first person to raise that, not criticism, but idea. When I was chatting to Ludovic, he come over for a summer school from Rouen, came to Shoe, and he said the exact same thing to me. And what we were chatting about is, or I said it'd be interesting, is to look at a person's behaviour, movement behaviour, negotiating a parkour environment without a performer, and then looking how that is different when you add an opponent in there.
Ah, wow, that'd be really fascinating.
Yeah, so that would plug the gaps in some of the questions that are being raised.
You mean an opponent, as in like a chase opponent?
Yeah. So like getting the tag game and looking at how behaviour within that environment is different when you add an opponent. So when you're adding that, for instance, that fidelity.
Because I have to say, whenever you watch video of the tag games, it's fascinating and it's amazing, isn't it? The movement capability at speed, rolling and dodging and ducking and all of those cut moves and all those sorts of things are really quite fascinating. It looks mega fun, I have to say, as well.
Yeah. It's something what we want to explore, but we just got that's what we're going to come on to towards the end of my PhD. I'm going to run a study with that, but we're just doing all them other research projects I talked about to build the foundations for us to be able to implement that sort of intervention or that sort of protocol, because we want it to be substantiated by evidence and by the literature.
Is there a multi-person form of parkour, as in, like, you, for example, run through a space in a kind of team?
I'm not sure, to be honest, but at the weekend we did some data collection and we got some GoPro footage of the parkour environment as a route to show people what the environment looks like. And I have a good video where it's one of my mates doing the run and then another one following him with a GoPro. And that was just really interesting to look at how they follow each other. The athletes follow each other to complete the route. But that's another area that we can explore. It's more, the groups are more the social, cultural dynamics in parkour. Like they have certain teams and stuff like that, and certain, groupings depending on where you are in the country or world.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's basically, I've got in my head basically a citywide giant game of Bulldog.
Yeah. People like that.
Sounds great.
I'm in. Sign me up.
In.
Definitely.
You have to go team.
So something to possibly be explored, Marianne, for the ranch.
Yeah. There's some amazing places, and that what's beautiful about that place is that things like a tree falls down, and what my brother does is moves a couple of branches so it's easy to climb on, gets rid of a bit of bark so that it's really inviting for the kids to be in, sticks a bit of sand underneath it.
Yeah.
And he's always inviting the exploration. So all he's done with it is go, this is a beautiful place. How can I increase the awareness of the affordances, basically, for people who are maybe haven't got quite as much imagination, or make it a little bit easier to engage in. So it's brilliant. I mean, the fact that it's got, the golf course and the pump track and all those other things, I'm always like, where's the wild spaces that he's good with?
I'd be on that golf course every day if I lived there.
But we'll definitely do a session there.
Yeah.
Definitely.
It pretty much ticks all the boxes for me. It's got
yeah. And bring your family. We can do it while it's open. 3 hours. We can play around. Join your family. They can come with us. We can experiment with them. That kind of has always been part of my.
my family are a bit sick of my experiments on them, sadly.
My parents always said that the amount of time I talk about it, they have a degree as well now.
Yes, the long-suffering relative. Ben, I'm really appreciative of your time, and I'm very conscious of it too. So I just wondered is there any, Marianne, Jimmy, have you got any other kind of thoughts to share before we sort of wrap up?
Well, I did wonder about like forest environments versus urban environments and the extent to which parkour kind of crosses those boundaries.
Wait out for this new paper that's coming out. It'll answer your questions and that.
Yeah. No teasers, no sneak previews, nothing.
No, wait till you read it.
It's like a stone.
One of my feelings in and around that is, and around the whole idea is whether we can encourage people at sort of policy level or urban planning level to consciously design more inviting, playful environments full with resplendent with the appropriate sociocultural layer as well, so that movement becomes something that is a little bit more embedded in our day-to-day, and couple that with the need for I suppose more vegetation and plants and trees and all the good that comes with that. I wonder if there's a way to kind of tackle simultaneous issues, with making urban environments a little bit more feel like closer to nature, which has benefits in terms of mental health. And
there are some very interesting large-scale experiments going on, which are meant to, and significant investments, which are meant to inform policy. Almost, I guess, large-scale test and learn type models. And so again, I know this is something that Sports England are doing, which is investing in place. And there's a significant investment, for example, in Greater Manchester, looking at and taking a whole system approach, very much driven through an ecological lens, and taking a whole system approach, multi-agency approach to tackling those very challenges. Because the idea of, these kind of almost these like top-down interventions around, move more, these sorts of things, really haven't had the effect that we're looking for. So it's about developing environmental, almost like building environmental affordances in and around people's communities, actually built with the communities from the ground up, and getting that information playing into the policymakers at local and then national level to then determine how they could tackle this. So, for example, I know, there was an experiment, a really interesting and very controversial experiment done in Waltham Forest, which and Walthamstow, in I think it's northeast London, I think, they actually the project was called Little Holland, and they blocked off roads that were very busy cut-throughs and and clogged with traffic, that were all basically flying off a major arterial road in order to be able to get through to different parts of London. Block them all off with planting and all these different things in order to create a space that would then facilitate more cycling and more walking, but particularly more cycling. And needless to say, like local business are like saying, you're killing my business because I'm not getting the through traffic. You've got massive opposition groups saying, we can't get deliveries into our thing. And then new micro businesses emerge, right? So like cycle-based delivery routes emerge, and the high street actually starts to find more traffic, but people on foot who would, otherwise have driven past to go to a major out of town shopping venue where there's easy parking. Instead of that, people can now cycle and walk to their local shop on their local high street. And so actually footfall and the use of those local businesses increases exponentially because it's actually afforded, as opposed to just people flying past in cars. So, and then the need for example, pedestrian crossing diminishes. The need for, barriers on the sides of roads by schools diminishes because you don't have that kind of traffic, and people feel an entirely different experience and a quality of life in their urban environment. It's just one example. But go on, sorry.
I remember reading that, and they started doing things like having more sort of like cafe space outside and stuff, didn't they? It just completely changed the way
people interact and the community. Yeah.
I just want to plug a good example of a very varied, a beautiful learning environment that you can look at in Sheffield. So we've just had a new Advanced Wellbeing Research Centre open at Sheffield Hallam University down in Attercliffe, and the building's really, really beautiful but around and amazing, really. And around there's loads of different obstacles and challenges that parkour athletes could explore, and it's all about moving more and getting healthier, independent lives. So check that out if you want to look at an environment what allows exploration and movement.
There was another
example. To plug that because
you're at it. You're at the coalface.
There's another example in Holland, I believe, where they turned off the traffic lights at a particularly troublesome intersection, and basically found that doing that decreased issues with traffic flow, just increased people's enjoyment and engagement and the interactions between people as well.
Courtesy.
Well, exactly, but also just
decision
they had to
making.
be engaged with their environment. They had to be aware that things are going to happen, rather than just sitting there waiting for the light to change and kind of being bored and disengaged. So I think there's loads of potential innovations in and around this, and it's being willing to critique the kind of institutions and ways of being and forms of life that we've created. It's an exciting space. I just wish there was more happening in it. I mean, the Little Holland story, Stu, you'd mentioned to me before, and that stuck with me as something that's really, really exciting.
But it's hard work. I mean, it's really hard work, and it takes, a number of my colleagues are involved in these projects, and the amount of work it takes to first and foremost, you have to almost. The biggest task is actually getting people to reframe the way they think about public policy and the way they think about, exactly. And that's actually the biggest task, is almost, because like everything is numerically driven, it's based on massive levels of reductionism and all these different drivers, and how they've almost had to create this safe space for actually usually people at relatively low levels of the policy making chain to be able to innovate and think and create with their local communities without the intervention of senior leaders who are just constantly looking for, hit the bottom line and these sorts of things. And actually that whole people dynamic is a huge learning experience around this whole process. So it's a bit of a watch this space, we're very much in the middle of it. And it's going to be very interesting then to see how that then plays into sort of, policy on a macro scale, governmental level. But hey, let's see, you can only hope, can't you?
Yep.
I'd be really interested. It'd be really interesting to see what you think of what my brother's done at the ranch, actually, because I think that's very much what you're trying to get at, James. That just slightly tweaking these natural spaces to encourage movement, even if it's just ball games or climbing or messing around, or to just make it a space to be active in any way, shape, or but just somewhere to really enjoy being active with whole families throughout a lifespan.
100%, and I think again, there's some interesting stuff coming out around in the mental health space around the benefits of being in nature.
Yeah,
I mean, there's a potential to a lot of problems can converge and kind of be aided by kind of novel interventions like this.
Thanks.
Well, we've in true talent equation style, we've massively digressed, but. It wouldn't be a talent equation gathering if we didn't. Ben, if you're prepared to, and we haven't scared you off, it would be great to check in with you at some stage further down the track. And don't be a stranger. Please let us know if you discover something on the journey and you're prepared to come and share it with us. We'd love to hear more and follow what you're finding.
I'd be more than happy to come back on the podcast. Really enjoyed it. Thanks for inviting me on.
No, brilliant.
I've listened to it a few times. So.
Oh, right, good. Well, I see. I'm amazed at the highbrow level of the listenership sometimes. Yeah. but no, I mean, to be fair, I think one of the things I hope that this thing does is just ask some questions, and we're all on this. We're all exploring stuff. You yourself, right at the start of this, I made a note of saying that the research in this space around the idea of sports, donor sports almost, is pretty thin, isn't it? So the fact that you're adding to the literature is really important, and I think it's going to be really exciting to see how this does develop.
It's also a good practice for your PhD viva as well, Marianne, and whoever's doing a PhD.
I know, that's why I said yes the first time.
So as I get closer to that, I'm definitely keen to
come back.
Yeah. The doing one about the skill transfer paper we did with Ludovic and the Coughlin and colleagues, that would be really good. That would be a a good discussion to do.
Who would be the author we would have on? Should we get Ed on? Who's the lead author of it?
Ludovic.
Okay.
Ludovic.
I think he'd be up for it.
Good. All right. We might have to reach out to that. I mean, there's loads of Ludovic stuff that I'm fascinated by. I saw him present on his stuff on swimming, and it was just absolutely mind blowing.
He's one of the, like, when I first met him, I was happy because it's one of the key influences in my work as well as Keith. So he's a great guy, great researcher.
Brilliant. Well, thank you everybody for coming on and exploring with us. And like I said, it'll be good to track things down. Are you active on the social space? If anybody wants to reach out to you, Ben?
Yeah. So I've got Twitter. It's let me just jog my memory. It's at BW Strafford, but I'm followed by Dynamics Coaching. So if you can't find me from my handle, just look at there. And I'm lucky enough to get a follow by it. Yeah.
And I think I've followed you, and if I haven't, I very, very quickly will.
My email as well is b.strafford@shu.ac.uk.
shu.ac.uk. Yeah.
So if you want anything, just send me an email. Happy to, or a tweet. I'm happy to accommodate.
Brilliant. Well, thanks everybody, and great to have you. Great to see you again. Good to see you, Marianne and Jimmy. Good to chat with you, and look forward to our next micro symposium in 4 to 6 weeks' time.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.